Right, so what would the consequences for Israel be if South Africa end up winning their case at the International Court of Justice? As we await the beginning of South Africa's case against Israel on the grounds of genocide beginning in The Hague tomorrow, the foremost legal expert in successful prosecutions under the Genocide Convention, and that's because he's the only lawyer to ever succeed in winning sanctions against a nation state for committing genocide in the history of the Genocide Convention, a chap called Francis Boyle, who is certain that South Africa will win their case against Israel. So he was asked what the legal consequences would be for Israel following a defeat in court, and what could actually follow. What could happen next? And as much as these things are far from certain, and as much as we can expect some form of pro-Israel bias to creep in somewhere, because it always seems to, let's take a look at where this will leave Israel and those supporting it, aiding and abetting in genocide, following a successful ruling for South Africa. Right, so Francis Boyle, the only lawyer to mount a successful prosecution under the Genocide Convention when he took Yugoslavia to the World Court over its genocide of Bosnia-Herzegovina, has weighed in on the prospects of South Africa succeeding against Israel at the International Court of Justice. And I covered much of what he had to say the other day in another video. But as much as we're hoping that South Africa win, what will happen next if they do? Obviously, we don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. The hearings don't begin until tomorrow. But if the eminent Francis Boyle is prepared to stick his neck out and say South Africa has got this, especially when he's read the court filings and gone through them all as you'd expect a lawyer to do with a fine-tooth comb, we might as well see where things would go afterwards if this is indeed the likeliest scenario in his opinion. So say a cease and desist order gets handed to Israel to end its genocide, as Francis Boyle believes will happen. This will have serious consequences for Israel. For one, there's its reputation. Before we even get into the legality and the consequences of that, reputation-wise, the entire world will then know that Israel's committing genocide against Palestinians. Their name will be mud. A court will have ruled on that. The World Court at that will have ruled on that. Frankly, anyone wanting to do trade or business with Israel at that point, despite that ruling, well, they aren't somebody you'd want to do business with, are they? You wouldn't want to buy their products, would you? But you know they'll be there. There'll be some. But at this point, all other countries signed up to the Genocide Convention under Article 1, or under the terms of Article 1, will then be obliged to act to prevent that genocide. So basically, if Israel decides to ignore the order, the judgment, all other signatories to the Genocide Convention will be obliged to act in a manner in accordance with stopping them in some way from doing what they're doing, from carrying on committing genocide. By law, they will have to stand with Palestine against Israel until the genocide stops. In effect, anyone not doing so would be in violation of Article 1, whether that be by siding with Israel or sitting on their hands. Siding with Israel, then, as would be the case during the court case starting tomorrow, would be aiding and abetting, which is criminalised under Article 3 of the Genocide Convention. So there could be ramifications for the likes of the US, certainly it seems, the UK in all likelihood as well, yet to follow. That would be separate litigation, of course. The easiest way to meet that obligation, to enforce the Genocide Convention, to enforce the World Court ruling, is for the order to be delivered by the World Court by South Africa, then to the United Nations and to the UN Security Council for them to vote on it for enforcement. Well, Security Council again. Here we have the US faced with a stark choice. They can continue to add to any potential future case built against them for aiding Israel in committing genocide under Article 3 by using that blasted veto of theirs again, which would kill off any enforcement of an International Court of Justice ruling by the Security Council. Massively dangerous to do, and its implications for global justice, of course, because ignoring and voting down such a legal ruling would render world justice a joke, wouldn't it? There would be no such thing, in effect. It would also be in direct violation of the terms of the UN Charter, which the US is also, of course, a signatory of. Unfortunately, Francis Boyle believes this is exactly what the US will do, because of their track record up until now. They might surprise us. They might abide by the ruling and do the right thing, in which case enforcement is handed down and Israel really had ought to stop. But we'll come back to what if they don't in a moment. But even if the US do veto it at the Security Council, as we've seen already, there's another way. By then taking the court order to the General Assembly instead, and having all UN nations vote through the enforcement under the Uniting for Peace resolution. That we would expect to pass, and that would then carry with it potential consequences for Israel at the UN itself, never mind just enforcement of the legal notice. So what could the UN do then, Damo? They seem rather toothless most of the time, don't they? Well, for one, the UN could suspend Israel as a member state from participating in UN activities. It wouldn't be the first time this has been done. South Africa themselves were suspended in such a way during the apartheid years there. Yugoslavia was also suspended by the UN for their genocidal actions in the Balkans, the very case Francis Boyle was successful in personally. So there's precedent for this. What could the UN do for Palestine? Well, at the moment, Palestine is a UN observer state, one of two, along with the Vatican City, which basically means it is recognised as a state and can, as it stands now, speak at the UN, as we have seen them do on numerous occasions, often most recently at failed UN Security Council votes. But they themselves do not have a vote in anything at all. Well, the UN General Assembly can change that by admitting Palestine as a full member state, making it a lot more difficult for certain nations to refuse to recognise Palestine as a state in its own right, such as us here in the UK, who still refuse to do so. This is something that would have to be voted on, but the votes are almost certainly there for this to pass. Given that we're witnessing ethnic cleansing and a desire to wipe Palestinians out, giving Palestine full member status would make it a lot harder for Israel to pretend it is doing anything other than trying to eliminate another, by then, UN member, with equal rights and status at the UN to themselves. This would offer Palestine additional protections that it doesn't have right now. In addition to that, the UN General Assembly could seek to take action in order to prosecute high-ranking Israeli figures for genocide. You can imagine somebody like Netanyahu would be high up on that list, can't you? They do that by setting up an international criminal tribunal, as again was previously done for Yugoslavia, under the terms of their UN Charter permitted under Article 22 of the UN Charter, which states, "The General Assembly may establish such subsidiary organs as it deems necessary for the performance of its functions." Short and sweet article, that one, isn't it? The International Criminal Tribunal would be a subsidiary organ as described in that article, a working group, in effect, which could begin the matter of prosecuting high-ranking Israeli officials for genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity committed against Palestinians. This could range from politicians to members of the IDF. The scope is huge, given what we're witnessing and have witnessed since October 7th, which is what South Africa have concentrated on in their ICJ submission. But of course, follow-up litigation could come, may follow suit, and that could go back a lot further. And then there is the matter of sanctions. The UN can recommend these too, just as embargoes were imposed on South Africa over apartheid once upon a time. So I can just about remember these things as a child. Israel can little afford more economic sanctions. The Houthis in Yemen already have had a significant impact on their economy that way. Further sanctions they could do without. But the Houthis could down tools should sanctions be imposed. Unfortunately, it's the UN Security Council again that has to impose sanctions. The General Assembly can only recommend them. So again, there's a risk the US will veto any recommended sanctions. But again, they would be seen to be aiding and abetting Israel by going against a UN recommendation and a court order. Just how far are the US prepared to go? Will they face a day in court themselves for doing so? Well, that would be a whole other court case. But if they carry on down this road, the risk of Genocide Joe and co having a day in the Hague too has to be an increasing one by that point. That said, again, it could come back to the General Assembly under the Uniting for Peace resolution that sanctions be imposed too. The sanctions against North Korea right now were put in place via this route, so it's got precedent as well. All in all, a court order really would open up new avenues for the UN to take in bringing Israel to book. But of course, we have to get that ruling first. The US are talking to everyone and anyone they can to try and swing things for Israel, even now, as sickening as that thought is for so many of us. What is helping them is that the current president of the ICJ, Joan Donoghue, is American and has been described by Francis Boyle as a career-long State Department apparatchik and legal hatchet person. So that's reassuring, isn't it? He's certain that she's feeding the US government information about what is going on behind the scenes right now at the ICJ. And she also has the power to shape how the proceedings go, which could favour Israel and the US. Seems likely to. In it together as they very much seem to be. You can look at it this way. If the US can't scupper this, they are probably heading to The Hague themselves at a later date for complicity. Nonetheless, the evidence is all on South Africa's side. Things get going tomorrow. I will be covering this. In the meantime, check out why that is the case by watching this video next, explaining how Israel's defence has already been torn apart before they've even got to The Hague. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.